What my sister didn't know when she mocked my dead-end job at our family reunion was that her own commanding officer was about to reveal a secret that would shatter everything she thought she knew about me and leave her questioning her entire military career. The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the parking lot of Riverside Community Center as I pulled my weathered Toyota Camry into a space between two gleaming SUVs. The family reunion was already in full swing, and I could hear the familiar sounds of the Rodriguez clan through the open windows, children laughing, music playing, and the animated chatter of relatives catching up after another year apart. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I sat in my car for a moment, adjusting the rearview mirror to check my appearance one more time. At 41, I looked exactly like what I was, a quiet maintenance supervisor at the local municipal building. My work clothes were clean but unremarkable: khaki pants, a simple polo shirt with City of Mesa facilities embroidered on the chest, and steel-toed work boots that had seen better days. My hair was graying at the temples, and I had the kind of tan that came from spending 8 hours a day fixing air conditioning units and unclogging drains in government buildings. Nothing about my appearance suggested that I had once commanded respect from some of the most elite soldiers in the United States Army. The community center buzzed with the energy of our extended family. Aunts, uncles, cousins, and their children filled picnic tables under colorful canopies, sharing homemade tamales and catching up on the year's events. The familiar aroma of grilled carne asada mixed with the desert air, creating that distinctive scent of Arizona family gatherings. I made my way through the crowd, exchanging hugs and pleasantries with relatives I only saw once a year. My cousin Maria immediately began updating me on her daughter's college success, while Uncle Roberto launched into his annual speech about the Diamondbacks' chances this season. Everything felt wonderfully normal and predictably comfortable. "Miguel, there you are." My mother, Elena Rodriguez, appeared at my elbow with a paper plate loaded with food. At 68, she still moved with the energy of someone half her age, her silver hair perfectly styled despite the heat. "I was wondering when you'd show up. Your sister's been asking about you." I accepted the plate gratefully, knowing better than to refuse my mother's cooking. "Thanks, Mama. How's the turnout this year?" "Bigger than ever. Your cousin David drove down from Phoenix with his whole family, and even your great-aunt Esperanza made the trip from Tucson." She paused, lowering her voice slightly. "Your sister brought some friends from the base, military people. They seem nice enough, but you know how she gets when she has an audience." I did know. My sister, Captain Isabella Rodriguez Chen, had always been the star of our family. Valedictorian, full scholarship to Arizona State, commissioned as an officer straight out of ROTC. She was everything our parents had dreamed of when they immigrated from Sonora 35 years ago. Successful, respected, and wearing the uniform of the country that had given them opportunities they'd never imagined. And then there was me, the older brother who had quietly enlisted after high school, served his time, and came home to what everyone assumed was a simple, unremarkable life fixing government buildings and keeping city facilities running. I spotted Isabella across the pavilion before she saw me. At 35, she commanded attention without trying. Her army dress uniform was crisp and perfect despite the heat, her posture military straight, and her voice carried easily over the family chatter as she regaled a group of relatives with stories from Fort Huachuca. Standing near her were 3 other soldiers, 2 lieutenants who couldn't have been more than 25, and an older man with Colonel's eagles on his shoulders who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "That's Colonel Harrison," my mother whispered, following my gaze. "Isabella's new commanding officer. She's been trying to impress him all afternoon." Isabella had always been impressive. Where I was quiet and preferred to work with my hands, she was articulate and ambitious. Where I had enlisted and worked my way up slowly through the ranks, she had taken the officer track and risen quickly through the intelligence corps. Our parents couldn't have been prouder when she made captain at 32, and they displayed her promotion photo prominently in their living room next to my high school graduation picture. What they didn't display, what nobody in my family knew, was the shadow box buried in my bedroom closet, containing ribbons and medals from a career that officially didn't exist. I worked my way through the crowd, stopping to admire my nephew's soccer trophies and listen to my aunt's detailed account of her recent knee surgery. The normalcy of it all felt good after so many years of living a carefully constructed double life. Here I was just Miguel Rodriguez, the reliable older brother who fixed things and showed up to family events with store-bought dessert and a quiet smile. The municipal job was perfect cover. Nobody questioned why a facility supervisor might have to work late sometimes, or why he occasionally received phone calls at odd hours, or why he took mysterious training seminars that lasted several days. To everyone who knew me, I was exactly what I appeared to be, a divorced, middle-aged man who had found his niche in civil service and seemed content with a simple, predictable life. Even my own family believed the story. As I approached the main group, I could hear Isabella's voice rising with enthusiasm as she described her latest assignment, coordinating logistics for joint training exercises. The colonel nodded politely, but I could see the fatigue in his eyes, the look of a senior officer who had attended too many family events where junior officers tried to network their way to better assignments. "Miguel," Isabella spotted me and waved me over with the kind of forced enthusiasm that suggested she was performing for her military audience. "Everyone, this is my big brother I was telling you about." The way she said big brother carried just a hint of condescension, the subtle tone of someone introducing a lovable but unremarkable relative. I recognized the setup immediately. Isabella was about to use me as a prop in whatever story she was telling about family diversity or humble beginnings. "Miguel works for the city," she announced to the group, her voice pitched to carry to nearby relatives who had started drifting over to meet the military guests. "He's in maintenance at the municipal building. Very steady work, very reliable." The pause before reliable was so slight that only someone who knew Isabella well would catch it, but it was there. The faint suggestion that while military service was dynamic and important, civilian jobs were mundane and forgettable. Colonel Harrison extended his hand with professional courtesy. "Mr. Rodriguez, thank you for your family's service." His handshake was firm, his eye contact direct, and something in his expression suggested he was assessing me the way military officers assess everyone, looking for signs of bearing, confidence, or hidden depth. "My pleasure, Colonel," I replied simply, matching his grip and meeting his gaze. For just a moment, I let a hint of my old command presence show through, the automatic response of someone who had once worn eagles of his own. But it was gone so quickly that nobody noticed. Nobody except, perhaps, the colonel, whose eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly as he studied my face. The afternoon was about to become much more interesting than anyone expected. The afternoon heat shimmered off the concrete as our family gathering continued under the pavilion's shade. I found myself seated at a picnic table with Isabella's military group, nursing a cold Coke while listening to the lieutenants discuss their recent field exercises. Lieutenant Sarah Chen, no relation to Isabella despite the shared surname, was enthusiastically describing a logistics nightmare they'd encountered during a training mission. "The whole supply chain fell apart," she explained, gesturing with her hands. 3 different units needed equipment at the same time, and nobody had coordinated the transport schedules. We ended up with vehicles sitting idle for 6 hours while critical supplies were stuck 50 miles away. Lieutenant Marcus Webb nodded sympathetically. "Classic coordination failure happens more often than people think, especially when you're dealing with multiple command structures." I listened quietly, occasionally sipping my drink, but something in their description triggered memories of similar situations I'd faced in very different circumstances. Without thinking, I found myself mentally reorganizing their logistics problem, identifying the bottlenecks and failure points with the automatic efficiency of someone who had solved much more complex puzzles under far more dangerous conditions. "You know," I said quietly, setting down my Coke, "it sounds like your main issue was centralized dispatch, trying to manage too many moving parts simultaneously." The table went quiet for a moment. Isabella raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised that her maintenance worker brother was commenting on military logistics. "What do you mean?" Lieutenant Chen asked politely, the way people ask follow-up questions when they're not expecting a meaningful answer. "Well," I continued, my voice remaining casual, "instead of routing everything through one central command, you could establish sector-based priority systems. Each unit maintains autonomous supply authority within predetermined parameters, but with real-time communication protocols to prevent overlap conflicts." Colonel Harrison's head turned slightly, his attention focusing on me with new interest. There was something in his expression, a flicker of recognition perhaps, or professional curiosity about how a city maintenance worker understood advanced logistics terminology. Lieutenant Webb leaned forward. "That's actually pretty sophisticated thinking. Where did you learn about military supply chain management?" I shrugged, keeping my tone light. "You pick things up. I coordinate maintenance schedules for 17 different city departments, same basic principles, moving resources efficiently while avoiding conflicts." It was true as far as it went. What I didn't mention was that I'd learned those principles while coordinating far more complex operations in places where failure meant people died. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Isabella laughed, but there was an edge to it. Miguel's always been good with puzzles. Remember those model airplanes you used to build, big brother? All those tiny pieces and detailed instructions. The comment was intended to be dismissive, reducing my insight to childhood hobby skills, but Colonel Harrison was still watching me with that measuring look. Something about my bearing, my vocabulary, or perhaps the calm confidence with which I'd analyzed their problem had caught his attention. The challenge, I continued, addressing Lieutenant Chen directly, is maintaining flexibility while ensuring accountability. You need commanders who can make autonomous decisions but still integrate with the larger mission framework. Exactly, Colonel Harrison spoke for the first time since the logistics discussion began. That balance between centralized control and distributed authority is one of the most difficult aspects of modern military operations. Our eyes met across the table, and for just a moment I saw him processing something, the way I held myself, the precision of my language, the fact that I was discussing complex operational theory without hesitation or uncertainty. In the military, you learn to recognize other military people, even years after they've left service. Something in our posture, our awareness, our way of analyzing situations never quite goes away. You seem to have given this a lot of thought, he observed carefully. Like I said, similar challenges in different contexts, I replied, maintaining my cover story while meeting his gaze steadily. When you're responsible for keeping critical infrastructure running, you learn about contingency planning and resource allocation. Isabella was growing visibly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. She had brought these military colleagues to showcase her own expertise and connections, not to listen to her maintenance worker brother discuss operational theory with her commanding officer. Speaking of work, she interjected with forced brightness, "Miguel, didn't you have some exciting drain cleaning adventure this week?" The comment was designed to redirect attention back to my supposedly mundane job, but it also revealed something about Isabella's need to diminish others to elevate herself. I'd seen this pattern before, insecure officers who built their confidence by highlighting the limitations of those around them. "Actually," I said mildly, "we had an interesting coordination challenge. The fire department needed access to hydrant systems while the water department was running pressure tests, and the street maintenance crew was scheduled for resurfacing in the same area, had to sequence everything to maintain emergency response capabilities while keeping the work moving." Lieutenant Webb whistled appreciatively. "That's like coordinating multiple military exercises in overlapping operational zones." "Similar principles," I agreed. What I didn't mention was that I'd once coordinated actual military exercises involving thousands of personnel across multiple countries, where the stakes were considerably higher than temporary water pressure issues. Colonel Harrison's expression had shifted from polite interest to something approaching professional curiosity. He was studying me the way experienced officers study potential assets, looking for capabilities that might not be immediately obvious. "How long have you been with the city, Mr. Rodriguez?" he asked. 15 years, I replied. It was true, I'd taken the job immediately after my official retirement from service, using it as cover for the consulting work that nobody in my family knew about. "That's quite a career change," Isabella laughed. "Miguel used to be in the army too, but just enlisted, regular soldier stuff, nothing like what we do now." She gestured to her colleagues with obvious pride. He got out and found his niche in civilian work. Much simpler, much more predictable. The condescension in her voice was becoming more pronounced, and I could see the lieutenants shifting uncomfortably. Even they seemed to recognize that Isabella was being unnecessarily dismissive of her own brother. But Colonel Harrison's attention remained fixed on me. There was something in his eyes now, a growing suspicion that the simple maintenance worker sitting across from him might not be quite what he seemed. "What was your MOS?" he asked casually, using the military term for job classification. 11B, I replied automatically, infantry. It was true, technically, that had been my original classification when I'd enlisted at 18. What I didn't mention were the subsequent classifications, the specialized training, the assignments that didn't appear on any public record. "And your rank when you got out?" I hesitated for just a fraction of a second, long enough for someone with Colonel Harrison's experience to notice. "Staff sergeant," I said finally. Another truth, though incomplete. I had been a staff sergeant among other things. The colonel nodded slowly, but his eyes never left my face. He was beginning to suspect that there was much more to my story than anyone at this family reunion realized, including my sister. The Arizona sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains, casting longer shadows across the community center pavilion. The family reunion was hitting its stride, with children running between tables and adults settling into those comfortable afternoon conversations that happen when relatives gather. But at our table, the atmosphere had shifted subtly. Isabella's carefully orchestrated introduction of her military colleagues was not going according to her plan. I could see the frustration building in my sister's eyes. She had brought Colonel Harrison and her fellow officers to this family gathering with a specific agenda to showcase her own military expertise and perhaps advance her career through informal networking. Instead, her maintenance worker brother was discussing advanced logistics theory and drawing the colonel's undivided attention. "You know what's funny," Isabella said, her voice carrying a forced lightness that I recognized from childhood. "Miguel always was the practical one in the family. While I was studying international relations and military strategy at ASU, he was, well, let's just say he chose a different path." The comment hung in the air like a challenge. Lieutenant Chen and Lieutenant Webb exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly sensing the tension between siblings but unsure how to navigate it. Colonel Harrison remained silent, but his eyes moved between Isabella and me with the calculated attention of someone accustomed to reading interpersonal dynamics. "Different doesn't mean lesser," Lieutenant Webb offered diplomatically, clearly trying to diffuse the situation. "Oh, of course not," Isabella replied quickly, her smile bright and artificial. "I just think it's important to recognize that there are different levels of responsibility in any organization. Some people are cut out for leadership roles, for making the big decisions that affect thousands of people. Others are better suited for support functions." The word support carried unmistakable condescension. She was establishing a hierarchy in front of her colleagues, positioning herself as the strategic thinker and me as the manual laborer. "Isabella," our mother appeared beside the table, carrying a fresh pitcher of iced tea. "Are you telling everyone about Miguel's promotion last month?" I felt a moment of panic. My mother, bless her heart, was proud of both her children and didn't understand the delicate social dynamics playing out at this table. Isabella's smile faltered for just a moment. "Oh, that. Miguel got promoted to senior facilities supervisor, very administrative." The way she said administrative made it sound like the most boring job imaginable. But Colonel Harrison leaned forward slightly, his interest clearly piqued. "Senior facilities supervisor," he repeated thoughtfully. "That's a significant responsibility. How many people do you supervise, Mr. Rodriguez?" "About 40 full-time staff," I replied carefully, "plus coordinating with contractors and emergency response teams when needed." "Emergency response coordination," the colonel noted. "That requires security clearances, doesn't it? Background investigations." I felt Isabella's eyes on me, sharp and suddenly suspicious. This wasn't going the direction she wanted, and she was beginning to realize that her attempts to diminish me were backfiring. "Some aspects do require clearances," I acknowledged. "Critical infrastructure protection, coordination with federal agencies during emergencies, that sort of thing." "Federal agencies," Isabella repeated, her voice taking on a sharper edge. "Miguel, you never mentioned anything about federal agencies. What kind of federal agencies?" The question carried an accusation. She was beginning to suspect that her older brother's job might be more complex than she'd realized, and that possibility threatened the narrative she'd constructed about our relative positions in life. "FEMA, mostly," I said truthfully. "Homeland Security occasionally. Standard emergency preparedness coordination." Colonel Harrison's eyebrows rose almost imperceptibly. "Those agencies didn't coordinate with random municipal maintenance supervisors. They coordinated with people who had significant responsibilities and appropriate security clearances." "You know," Isabella said, her tone becoming more aggressive, "I think Miguel might be overselling his job a little bit. I mean, let's be honest about what facilities maintenance really means." She turned to address her colleagues directly. "He fixes air conditioners and unclogs toilets. It's honest work, but let's not pretend it's anything more sophisticated than that." The silence that followed was painful. Even the lieutenants looked uncomfortable with Isabella's blunt dismissal of her own brother. Our mother had stopped pouring tea and was staring at her daughter with a shocked expression. "Isabella," she said sharply, "what has gotten into you?" But Isabella was committed to her course now. Driven by some combination of professional insecurity and sibling rivalry that had been building all afternoon. She had worked too hard to establish her military credentials to let her older brother upstage her in front of her commanding officer. I'm just saying, Mama, that there's a difference between real responsibility, maintenance work. Some of us are responsible for national security, for training soldiers, for making decisions that matter. Others fix broken pipes. The cruelty in her voice was unmistakable now. This wasn't playful sibling rivalry. This was a deliberate attempt to humiliate me in front of her colleagues and our family. Lieutenant Chen looked like she wanted to disappear under the table. Lieutenant Webb was studying his hands intently. Colonel Harrison, however, was watching the entire exchange with the focused attention of someone who recognized that important information was being revealed, not about me but about Isabella. That's quite enough, our mother said firmly. Miguel has always been. Has always been what, Mama? Isabella interrupted. The family disappointment? The one who took the easy path while I earned my commission and built a real career. The words hung in the desert air like a slap. Around us, other family members were beginning to notice the tension at our table. Conversations were quieting as relatives turned to see what was happening. Isabella had crossed a line, and she knew it. But instead of backing down, she doubled down with the desperate aggression of someone who felt cornered.
I mean, let's be realistic here, she continued, her voice rising slightly. Miguel's 41 years old, divorced, living in a rental apartment, working a dead-end government job that requires no real skills or education. Meanwhile, I'm a commissioned officer in the United States Army, responsible for training and logistics operations that directly support our nation's defense. She turned to Colonel Harrison with triumphant confidence. Sir, I think you can see the difference between someone who serves their country in a meaningful way and someone who maintains buildings. The colonel's expression had gone completely neutral, the carefully blank face that senior military officers use when they're about to witness something that will end badly for everyone involved. Because what Isabella didn't know, what none of them knew, was that in 15 minutes Colonel Harrison was going to receive a phone call that would change everything. A phone call that would reveal exactly who Miguel Rodriguez really was, and why his dead-end job was the most sophisticated cover story the government had ever created.
The aftermath of Isabella's verbal assault settled over our table like desert dust after a windstorm. I sat quietly, my hands folded around my Coke can, while my sister's words echoed in the sudden silence. Around us, the family reunion continued, but our immediate area had become an island of uncomfortable tension. Isabella looked around the table with the satisfied expression of someone who believed she had definitively established the social hierarchy. Her colleagues were her audience, her family was witness to her military superiority, and her maintenance worker brother had been properly put in his place. In her mind, she had successfully demonstrated the vast gulf between a commissioned officer and a simple civil servant. Well, she said with forced brightness, clearly expecting validation from her military colleagues, I think that clarifies things nicely, but the response she received wasn't what she anticipated. Lieutenant Chen was staring at her plate, her face flushed with embarrassment. Lieutenant Webb was looking everywhere except at Isabella, obviously wishing he could be anywhere else. Even our mother had stepped back from the table, her expression a mixture of shock and disappointment. Colonel Harrison, however, was studying Isabella with the clinical attention of a scientist examining an interesting specimen. His expression revealed nothing, but there was something in his eyes, a professional assessment that suggested he was cataloging what he'd just witnessed for future reference. Captain Rodriguez Chen, he said quietly, his voice carrying the measured tone that senior officers use when they're not pleased. That was quite illuminating. Isabella's confident smile flickered slightly. She had expected approval, perhaps even praise for her directness. Instead, she was receiving the kind of careful attention that usually preceded uncomfortable conversations about leadership and character. "Sir?" she asked, uncertainty creeping into her voice. "Nothing that can't wait," Colonel Harrison replied, but his tone suggested that there would indeed be a conversation later, one that Isabella might not enjoy. Meanwhile, I remained silent, observing the dynamics around the table with the practiced eye of someone who had spent years reading people and situations. Isabella had revealed more about herself in the past few minutes than she realized. Her need to dominate, her willingness to humiliate family in front of colleagues, her assumption that rank automatically conferred worth, all of it painted a picture of an officer with serious character deficiencies. The irony wasn't lost on me. While Isabella was attempting to demonstrate her superiority through public humiliation, She was actually showcasing exactly the kind of behavior that ended military careers. Real leaders didn't need to diminish others to establish their authority. Real leaders understood that respect was earned through competence and character, not through rank and cruelty. "Miguel," our mother said softly, her voice heavy with maternal concern. "Mijo, I'm so sorry. I don't know what's gotten into her." "It's okay, Mama," I replied gently, keeping my tone calm and steady. "Isabella's under a lot of pressure. Sometimes stress makes people say things they don't mean." It was a gracious response, more gracious than Isabella deserved, and I could see Colonel Harrison noting my reaction with interest. Where Isabella had shown petty cruelty, I was demonstrating restraint and understanding. Where she had been aggressive and self-serving, I was being protective of family harmony. "Pressure?" Isabella laughed, but there was a sharp edge to it now. "Miguel, you wouldn't understand pressure. You've never had real responsibility. You've never had to make decisions that affect other people's lives. You've never had to." Isabella, Colonel Harrison's voice cut through her rant with quiet authority. "Perhaps we should discuss your perspective on leadership and responsibility at a more appropriate time." The suggestion carried the weight of a direct order, and Isabella had enough military training to recognize it. She closed her mouth abruptly, but I could see the frustration building in her eyes. Her grand performance was being curtailed just as she was hitting her stride. Lieutenant Chen cleared her throat nervously. "Sir, maybe we should." The sound of Colonel Harrison's phone ringing interrupted her suggestion. The colonel glanced at the display, and something in his expression changed, a subtle shift from social mode to professional attention. "Excuse me," he said, standing up from the table. "I need to take this." As he walked a few steps away for privacy, Isabella seized the opportunity to reassert her narrative. "Look," she said to her colleagues in a lower voice, "I know that seemed harsh, but you have to understand our family dynamics. Miguel's always been the one who settled for less. Our parents immigrated here with nothing, worked multiple jobs to give us opportunities, and I've tried to honor that sacrifice by excelling in military service. Miguel chose differently." She painted herself as the dutiful daughter who had maximized her potential, while portraying me as the disappointment who had wasted the opportunities our parents had provided. It was a compelling narrative, especially since it contained enough truth to be believable. Family dynamics can be complicated, Lieutenant Webb offered diplomatically, clearly uncomfortable with the entire situation. "Exactly," Isabella continued, warming to her theme, "and sometimes you have to be direct about reality. Miguel's a good person, but he's never had ambition, never pushed himself. He enlisted because he didn't know what else to do, served his time doing basic infantry work, and then found the most comfortable, undemanding job he could. There's nothing wrong with that, but let's not pretend it's the same as military leadership." She was creating a comprehensive character assassination disguised as loving concern. In her version, I was the well-meaning but limited older brother who had chosen comfort over challenge, mediocrity over excellence. It was a story that positioned her as both superior and compassionate, the successful sister who still cared about her underachieving sibling. Lieutenant Chen nodded politely, but I could see doubt in her eyes. Something about Isabella's need to continually justify herself was raising red flags for the younger officer. Meanwhile, Colonel Harrison's phone conversation was becoming more animated. I couldn't hear the words, but his body language suggested he was receiving information that was both important and surprising. He was asking questions, taking notes on a small pad he'd pulled from his pocket, and occasionally glancing back toward our table with an expression I couldn't quite read. "The point is," Isabella concluded, "there are different kinds of people in this world. Some are meant to lead, to take on real responsibility, to make a difference. Others are meant to maintain things, to keep the basic infrastructure running while the real leaders handle the important decisions." It was the culmination of her assessment, her final judgment on who Miguel Rodriguez was and where he fit in the world's hierarchy. She had evaluated me, found me wanting, and dismissed me as unworthy of serious consideration. What she didn't realize was that Colonel Harrison had just received information that was about to shatter every assumption she'd made. Information that would reveal that her maintenance worker brother was someone she had never imagined him to be. Information that would expose her cruel assessment as not just wrong, but devastatingly, career-endingly wrong. Colonel Harrison's phone conversation stretched on, and with each passing minute, Isabella's confidence seemed to grow. She had successfully established her narrative, positioned herself as the family's military success story, and relegated me to the role of well-meaning but unremarkable older brother. Now she was ready to test how far she could push her advantage. "You know what really bothers me about this whole situation?" Isabella said, her voice carrying just loud enough for nearby family members to hear. "It's the way Miguel lets people think his job is more important than it actually is." Lieutenant Chen shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "Captain, maybe we should." "No, I think this is important," Isabella interrupted, her eyes gleaming with the confidence of someone who believed she held all the cards. "Military families understand sacrifice, right? We understand what it means to serve something bigger than ourselves, but civilian families sometimes don't get that distinction." She was painting herself as the military expert, educating her colleagues about the challenges of dealing with civilian relatives who didn't understand real service. It was a calculated move designed to position her as the authority figure while further diminishing my standing. "Like this whole emergency coordination thing Miguel mentioned," she continued, making air quotes with her fingers. "He makes it sound so official. But let's be honest, he's talking about calling the fire department when a water pipe breaks in a government building. That's not emergency management, that's basic maintenance protocol." Our cousin Maria, who had been chatting with her daughter nearby, looked over with a puzzled expression. She had always been proud of both Isabella and me, and this public dissection of family dynamics was clearly making her uncomfortable. "Isabella," Maria said carefully, "why are you?" "I'm just being realistic, Prima," Isabella replied with a patronizing smile. "Miguel's job is fine for what it is, but let's not inflate it into something it's not. I coordinate logistics for hundreds of soldiers, manage multi-million-dollar equipment transfers, and work directly with Pentagon officials on training operations. Miguel fixes air conditioners." The comparison was brutal and deliberately reductive. She was systematically dismantling any respect my family might have had for my work, using her military rank as a bludgeon to establish hierarchy. Lieutenant Webb looked increasingly uncomfortable. "Captain, with respect, maybe this isn't the appropriate. What's inappropriate," Isabella cut him off, "is the way civilian families sometimes overvalue mundane work just because it involves government employment. There's a big difference between being a commissioned officer responsible for national defense and being a civil servant who maintains buildings." She was testing the boundaries now, seeing how far she could push her authority and whether anyone would challenge her. The young lieutenants were clearly outranked and wouldn't contradict a captain in front of her family. Our relatives were confused and uncomfortable, but didn't understand military protocol well enough to intervene. I remained silent, recognizing the pattern. Isabella was drunk on her own perceived power, emboldened by having an audience that couldn't effectively challenge her. She was making the classic mistake of someone who confuses temporary advantage with permanent superiority. "Here's what I don't understand," Isabella continued, warming to her theme. "Miguel, you're 41 years old. You've been out of the military for what, 15 years? In that time, I've earned my commission, completed multiple advanced training programs, been promoted to captain, and taken on increasingly complex responsibilities. What have you accomplished?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. She was demanding that I justify my existence according to her metrics of success. It was a power play designed to force me into either defending myself, which would validate her authority to judge me, or remaining silent, which would confirm her assessment of my limitations. "Isabella," our mother said sharply, her maternal instincts finally overriding her confusion about the military dynamics. "That's enough. I don't know what's gotten into you, but this is your brother." "Exactly, Mama. He's my brother, and I love him. But love doesn't mean pretending that everyone's choices are equally valuable. Some people serve their country in meaningful ways, and others don't." The cruelty was breathtaking in its casual delivery. Isabella was systematically destroying my reputation while claiming it was an act of love and honesty. She was testing whether she could redefine our entire family dynamic based on her military rank and my apparent civilian mediocrity. "You know what really gets me?" she pressed on, encouraged by the shocked silence around the table. "Miguel could have done more with his military experience. He could have used his GI benefits for education, could have leveraged his service into a real career, could have made something of himself. Instead, he chose the path of least resistance." She was painting a picture of wasted potential and poor choices, contrasting my supposed failures with her obvious successes. Each word was carefully chosen to establish her as the family's true achievement while relegating me to the role of cautionary tale. Lieutenant Chen finally found her voice. Captain, I really think we should. Should what? Should pretend that all jobs are equally important? Should act like maintaining government buildings is the same as defending our nation? Isabella's voice was rising now, her excitement at having a captive audience overriding her military discipline. Miguel had the same opportunities I did. He chose not to pursue them. That's his right, but let's not pretend it's admirable or that it deserves the same respect as actual military service. The test was complete. Isabella had pushed as far as she could, established her authority as completely as possible, and reduced me to the status of family disappointment in front of her colleagues and our relatives. She had proven to her own satisfaction that she was the dominant Rodriguez sibling and that her military rank gave her the right to judge and dismiss my life choices. What she didn't realize was that Colonel Harrison had just finished his phone conversation and was walking back toward our table with an expression that suggested the entire dynamic was about to change. What she didn't know was that the phone call had been about me. What she couldn't have imagined was that in the next few minutes, every assumption she had made, every cruel word she had spoken, and every test of authority she had conducted was about to be revealed as the ranting of someone who had never understood who she was really talking to. The test was over, and Isabella was about to discover that she had failed it more completely than she could have ever imagined. Colonel Harrison approached our table with measured steps, his phone call complete, but Isabella was too caught up in her moment of triumph to notice the subtle change in his demeanor. She had successfully established herself as the family's military authority and was now ready to drive her point home with ruthless efficiency. "You know what's really telling?" Isabella continued, her voice carrying across the pavilion with military confidence. "Miguel never talks about his military service, never mentions his unit, never shares war stories, never even displays any military memorabilia. You know why? Because there's nothing worth mentioning." She gestured broadly, including our gathered family members as witnesses to her assessment. 4 years of basic infantry work, probably spent most of his time on base doing menial tasks. No special training, no leadership positions, no significant achievements, just existing until his enlistment was up. Our uncle Roberto, a man who had always respected both his nephew and niece equally, shifted uncomfortably. "Isabella, Mija, that seems honest." "Tio?" She interrupted smoothly. "And honesty is what this family needs. We've spent years tiptoeing around Miguel's choices, treating his ordinary job like it's something special because we don't want to hurt his feelings. But what message does that send to the younger generation?" She pointed toward my teenage nephew Carlos, who was watching the entire exchange with wide-eyed confusion. "Carlos, what do you think is more admirable? Someone who pushes themselves to excel, who takes on real responsibility and serves their country as an officer, or someone who chooses the comfortable path and maintains buildings?" The manipulation was breathtaking. Isabella was using my nephew as a prop to reinforce her message while positioning herself as the role model worthy of emulation. She was forcing a 16-year-old to choose sides in an adult conflict that he couldn't possibly understand. I don't know, Tia," Carlos stammered, clearly uncomfortable with being put on the spot. "Of course you don't," Isabella said with patronizing kindness, "because this family has never had honest conversations about success and mediocrity. We've pretended that all choices are equal when they clearly aren't." Lieutenant Chen looked like she wanted to crawl under the table. The young officer was witnessing her captain publicly humiliate her own family member while using military rank to justify cruelty. It was exactly the kind of behavior that destroyed unit cohesion and violated every principle of military leadership. But Isabella was beyond caring about her colleagues' comfort. She had found her rhythm and was determined to finish what she had started. "Let me tell you what real military service looks like," she announced, turning back to address the entire gathered family. "Real military service means making life and death decisions. It means being responsible for other people's safety. It means working 18-hour days to ensure mission success. It means sacrificing personal comfort for the greater good." She paused dramatically, letting her words sink in before delivering her devastating comparison. Miguel's version of military service was showing up, following orders, and collecting a paycheck until he could get out and find the most comfortable civilian job possible. There's a word for that kind of service. Minimal. The attack was total now. Isabella wasn't just diminishing my current job. She was retroactively destroying my military service, painting me as someone who had done the bare minimum while in uniform. She was rewriting history to support her narrative of superiority. "Isabella," our mother's voice cracked with emotion. How can you say such things about your own brother? Because someone needs to, Mama, Isabella replied with cold determination. This family has spent years enabling Miguel's mediocrity by treating it like achievement. Look around this table, look at the faces of these soldiers who actually understand what military service means. Do you think they're impressed by someone who fixes toilets for the city? She was using her colleagues as validators, forcing them to be complicit in her attack by suggesting that their silence meant agreement. It was a manipulative tactic that put the young officers in an impossible position. Colonel Harrison had reached our table but remained standing, observing the scene with the careful attention of someone who was witnessing something significant. Isabella, however, was too focused on her assault to notice his return. Here's what I think happened, she continued, building toward her climactic assessment. Miguel enlisted because he didn't know what else to do after high school. He served his time doing whatever basic infantry soldiers do, probably guard duty and equipment maintenance. He never distinguished himself, never showed leadership potential, never earned any significant promotions or recognitions. Then he got out and found the first government job that would give him steady pay and benefits without requiring any real ambition or growth. She looked directly at me with something approaching pity, and for 15 years, he's been coasting. Same job, same routine, same limited perspective. While I've been advancing my career, leading soldiers and taking on increasing responsibility, Miguel has been maintaining the status quo. The pressure was relentless now. Isabella had constructed a comprehensive narrative that painted me as a failure in every meaningful way, militarily, professionally, and personally. She had positioned herself as the family's sole success story while reducing me to a cautionary tale about wasted potential. And the saddest part, she concluded with devastating finality, is that Miguel seems content with it. No ambition to improve, no desire to challenge himself, no recognition that he could be doing something more meaningful with his life. He's become exactly what our parents immigrated to this country to escape, someone who settles for less. The silence that followed was deafening. Isabella had not just attacked my career or my choices, she had attacked our parents' sacrifice and my fundamental worth as a human being. She had suggested that my very existence was a betrayal of the opportunities America had provided our family. It was the kind of comprehensive character assassination that left no room for recovery or reconciliation. Isabella had burned every bridge and salted the earth behind her. She had committed herself completely to her position, making it impossible to back down without losing face entirely. Colonel Harrison cleared his throat softly. "Captain Rodriguez Chen," he said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made everyone at the table instantly focus on him. "I think it's time we had a conversation about your brother's actual military service." Isabella turned toward him with confident expectation, clearly anticipating validation of her assessment from her commanding officer. What she saw instead was an expression that suggested she had just made the biggest mistake of her military career. The Arizona afternoon had reached that golden hour when the desert sun cast everything in warm amber light, but the atmosphere at our family reunion table had turned ice cold. Colonel Harrison's words hung in the air like a challenge, and suddenly every person within earshot had stopped their conversations to focus on our gathering. What had started as a private family dispute had become a very public spectacle. Aunts, uncles, cousins, and their children had gradually migrated closer to our table, as Isabella's voice had risen throughout her systematic destruction of my reputation. Now they formed a loose semicircle around us, their faces showing mixtures of confusion, embarrassment, and growing concern. Isabella, however, seemed oblivious to the expanding audience. If anything, the presence of more witnesses appeared to energize her. She had the floor, she had her commanding officer's attention, and she clearly expected validation for her devastating assessment of her older brother's failures. "Colonel Harrison," she said with the confident tone of an officer who believed she was about to receive professional affirmation, "I appreciate you wanting to discuss this further. I know it might seem harsh to be so direct about family dynamics, but I think leadership requires honesty about performance and potential." She stood up slightly, assuming a more formal military posture as she prepared to receive what she assumed would be praise for her clear-eyed evaluation of civilian versus military service. The movement drew even more attention from our relatives, who pressed closer to hear what the senior officer would say. "You see, sir," Isabella continued, "I've been trying to help my family understand the difference between actual military service and, well, what Miguel experienced. I think it's important for them to recognize that not all veterans are the same. that there are different levels of contribution and achievement. Colonel Harrison remained silent, but his expression was unreadable in that particular way that senior military officers master when they're about to deliver news that will change everything. He looked around the gathered crowd of my relatives, taking in their faces, assessing the situation with the calculated attention of someone who understood that what happened next would have lasting consequences. "Captain," he said finally, his voice carrying clearly in the desert evening air, "I think this conversation requires the full attention of everyone present." It wasn't a request, it was a command delivered with the quiet authority that made people stop moving and focus completely. The remaining scattered conversations around the pavilion died away as the colonel's words carried across the space. My mother, father, aunts, uncles, cousins, and their children all turned toward our table with the complete attention that comes when people sense that something important, possibly life-changing, is about to happen. Even the children stopped their running and playing to watch the gathering of adults around the picnic table. Isabella seemed to interpret this as confirmation of her position. The senior officer was making her family pay attention to the lesson she had been trying to teach them about real military service versus civilian mediocrity. "Exactly, sir," she said with growing confidence. "I think it's important for my family to understand these distinctions. They need to hear from someone with your experience and authority about what actual military leadership looks like." Lieutenant Chen and Lieutenant Webb exchanged worried glances. They could see the trap that Isabella was walking into, but their junior rank made it impossible for them to warn their captain about the dangerous path she was pursuing. They were trapped in their chairs, forced to watch their superior officer commit professional suicide in front of her entire extended family. Colonel Harrison reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small notebook, the same one he had been writing in during his phone conversation. He flipped through several pages, reading silently while the entire gathered Rodriguez clan waited in tense anticipation. "Captain Rodriguez Chen," he said finally, looking up from his notes, "before we continue this discussion about your brother's military service, I want to make sure I have everyone's complete attention." He looked around the circle of faces surrounding our table, making eye contact with each of my relatives in turn. When he spoke again, his voice carried the kind of authority that made even the youngest children stand still and listen. "What I'm about to share with you is information that will fundamentally change your understanding of this conversation. It will also require that everyone present understands the serious nature of what they're about to learn." The formality of his tone sent a ripple of tension through the crowd. This wasn't going to be a simple correction or clarification. This was going to be a revelation that would alter everything they thought they knew. Isabella's confidence flickered for the first time. Something in the colonel's tone suggested that this conversation wasn't going to validate her position the way she had expected, but she was trapped now by her own comprehensive attack on my character. She had gone too far to back down, said too much to claim misunderstanding. "Yes, sir," she stammered slightly. "I think my family should understand the realities of military service." "Good," Colonel Harrison replied with grim satisfaction, "because what they're about to learn about your brother's basic infantry service and his dead-end maintenance job is going to be quite educational for everyone involved." He looked directly at Isabella with the steady gaze of someone who was about to deliver a lesson that she would never forget. "Especially for you, Captain." The way he said her rank carried a weight that suggested it might not be her rank much longer. Isabella's face went pale as she began to realize that she had made a catastrophic miscalculation. But there was no escape now. The entire family was watching, her colleagues were trapped as witnesses, and Colonel Harrison was preparing to reveal information that would expose her cruel assessment as not just wrong, but devastatingly, career-endingly wrong. The stage was set, the audience was captive, and the truth about Miguel Rodriguez was about to destroy everything Isabella thought she knew about her family, her brother, and herself. Colonel Harrison closed his notebook and placed it deliberately on the picnic table, the small action carrying the weight of a gavel falling in a courtroom. The entire Rodriguez family stood in rapt attention, forming a semicircle around our table as the desert evening air grew thick with anticipation. Isabella, sensing that the conversation wasn't proceeding as she had expected, decided to take control of the narrative one final time. Her military training had taught her that when facing uncertainty, a good officer seizes the initiative and maintains the offensive. Unfortunately for her, this situation required wisdom rather than aggression. "Sir," she said, straightening to her full height and adopting her most professional tone, "I want to be clear about my intentions here. I'm not trying to embarrass my brother or diminish his choices. I'm simply trying to help my family understand the reality of different types of service." She gestured toward me with what she probably thought was sympathetic authority. "Miguel is a good man, and I love him. But love doesn't require us to pretend that all careers are equally challenging or meaningful. Someone has to be honest about the difference between commissioned leadership and basic support roles." The words hung in the desert air like a final insult. Even now, with her commanding officer's ominous tone suggesting serious consequences ahead, Isabella couldn't resist one more attack on my military service and civilian career. "You see, Colonel," she continued, warming to her theme despite the warning signs, "Miguel has never understood what real responsibility looks like. He's never had to make the hard decisions, never had to lead troops in difficult situations, never had to balance complex operational requirements with personnel management." She was doubling down on her assessment, painting me as someone who had lived an entire adult life without facing real challenges or developing genuine leadership skills. In her mind, she was demonstrating professional insight and family honesty to her commanding officer. And frankly, sir, I think his current job reflects that limitation. Municipal maintenance work might be necessary, but it doesn't require strategic thinking, crisis management, or the ability to operate under pressure. It's comfortable, predictable, safe. Lieutenant Chen looked like she was witnessing a car accident in slow motion. The young officer could see the disaster approaching but was powerless to prevent it. Lieutenant Webb had his head in his hands, clearly understanding that his captain was committing professional suicide with every word. But Isabella was beyond stopping now. She had committed herself to this course of action so completely that retreat would mean admitting she had been wrong about everything. Her pride, her professional identity, and her family standing all depended on being right about her assessment of her older brother. "The truth is, Colonel, Miguel has spent his entire adult life avoiding real challenges. Military service, civilian career, even his personal relationships. He's consistently chosen the path that requires the least growth, the least risk, the least actual leadership." She looked around at our gathered family members with the expression of someone delivering difficult but necessary medicine. "I know that sounds harsh, but leadership sometimes requires difficult honesty. Our parents sacrificed everything to give us opportunities in this country, and I've tried to honor that sacrifice by excelling in military service. Miguel chose differently." The attack had become personal in the most devastating way possible. Isabella wasn't just questioning my professional competence or career choices, she was attacking my fundamental character, suggesting that I had dishonored our parents' sacrifice and lived a life of deliberate mediocrity. "And I think," she continued, her voice rising with conviction, "that our family needs to stop enabling that mediocrity by treating ordinary work like extraordinary service. When we pretend that maintaining city buildings is equivalent to defending our nation, we're doing a disservice to everyone who actually pushes themselves to excel." Colonel Harrison remained silent throughout this final assault, his expression unreadable but his attention complete. I could see him cataloging every word, every tone, every assumption that Isabella was making about military service, leadership, and the relative worth of different careers. Our mother was crying now, tears streaming down her face as she watched her daughter systematically destroy her son's reputation in front of the entire extended family. Our father stood with his hands clenched at his sides, clearly struggling between his respect for military authority and his protective instincts toward his older child. "The bottom line, sir," Isabella concluded with devastating finality, "is that some people are born to lead, and others are born to follow. Some people embrace challenge and responsibility, while others seek comfort and routine. Miguel has consistently chosen comfort over growth, and I think it's time our family acknowledged that reality instead of pretending otherwise." She had delivered her final judgment. I was fundamentally limited, inherently mediocre, and constitutionally incapable of the kind of achievement she represented. In her version of reality, I was the family's cautionary tale, while she was its shining success. "Captain Rodriguez Chen," Colonel Harrison said quietly, his voice cutting through the desert evening air with surgical precision. "Thank you for that comprehensive assessment of your brother's character and capabilities." Isabella smiled, clearly interpreting his words as professional validation of her analysis. "Now," the colonel continued, his tone taking on an edge that made even the children in the crowd stand perfectly still, "let me share with you what I learned during that phone call about Miguel's actual military service." He reached for his notebook and opened it with deliberate ceremony, preparing to reveal information that would shatter every assumption Isabella had made. "And then," he added with grim satisfaction, "we're going to discuss what your assessment of him tells me about your fitness for military leadership." Isabella's confident smile began to fade as she realized that her commanding officer wasn't about to validate her position. He was about to destroy it. Colonel Harrison's fingers traced the pages of his notebook with deliberate precision, each movement charged with the tension of impending revelation. The entire Rodriguez family stood frozen in the desert evening air, sensing that they were about to witness something that would fundamentally alter their understanding of everything they thought they knew. Isabella, however, remained oblivious to the magnitude of her miscalculation. In her mind, she had successfully demonstrated professional insight and family honesty to her commanding officer. She had exposed the uncomfortable truth about her brother's limitations and established herself as the family's genuine military achievement. "Sir," she said with continued confidence, "I know this might seem like difficult family dynamics, but I believe honest assessment is essential to military leadership. Sometimes we have to acknowledge uncomfortable truths about performance and potential." She was still digging, still convinced that her systematic destruction of my reputation would be validated by professional military authority. The irony was devastating. In her effort to demonstrate leadership qualities, Isabella was showcasing exactly the kind of character deficiencies that ended military careers. Colonel Harrison looked up from his notebook, his eyes scanning the faces of my gathered relatives before settling on Isabella with laser focus. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of someone who understood the weight of the information he was about to reveal. "Captain Rodriguez Chen," he said with measured formality, "before I share what I learned about your brother's military service, I want to establish something very clearly for everyone present." He stood up slowly, his movement commanding instant attention from every person in the crowd. The casual family gathering atmosphere had evaporated completely, replaced by the kind of formal military bearing that made even children stand at attention. "There are certain boundaries that should never be crossed when discussing military service," he continued, his voice carrying across the pavilion with unmistakable authority. "Certain assumptions that should never be made without complete information. Certain judgments that reveal more about the person making them than about their target." Isabella's confident expression began to waver slightly. Something in the colonel's tone suggested that this conversation was moving in a direction she hadn't anticipated. "Military service, Captain, comes in many forms," Colonel Harrison continued, his words carrying the weight of professional instruction. "Some of it is visible, some of it is classified, and some of it is so highly classified that even the existence of certain units and operations remains hidden from public knowledge." He paused, letting that information sink in before continuing. "When you make assumptions about someone's military service based on limited information, you risk not only embarrassing yourself but also potentially compromising operational security that has been maintained for decades." The formality of his language sent a chill through the crowd. This wasn't going to be a simple correction or clarification. This was beginning to sound like a national security briefing delivered at a family picnic. "Sir," Isabella said uncertainly, "I'm not sure I understand what you're suggesting." "What I'm suggesting, Captain, is that you have spent the last hour systematically attacking the character and service record of someone whose actual military background you know nothing about." Colonel Harrison's words hung in the desert air like an accusation. For the first time since this confrontation began, Isabella looked genuinely uncertain about her position. "But sir," she protested, "Miguel was basic infantry. 11B, 4 years, discharged as a staff sergeant. I know his service record." "Do you?" Colonel Harrison asked quietly. "Do you really?" The question carried implications that made everyone present lean forward slightly, sensing that they were about to learn something extraordinary. "Captain, let me ask you something," the colonel continued. "In your experience, how many municipal maintenance supervisors require top-secret security clearances? How many civilian infrastructure workers have direct communication protocols with FEMA, Homeland Security, and the Pentagon? How many city employees have emergency contact procedures that route through Special Operations Command?" Isabella's face went pale. These weren't the credentials of an ordinary municipal worker. These were the markers of someone with connections to the highest levels of national security infrastructure. "Sir, you don't understand," Colonel Harrison repeated with grim satisfaction. "Because you've been making assumptions based on incomplete information. You've been attacking someone whose actual service record you've never seen, and whose current responsibilities you've never investigated." He opened his notebook and held it up so the gathered crowd could see pages of handwritten notes. "This phone call I just completed was with the Department of Defense Personnel Center, the Special Operations Command Historical Office, and 3 different intelligence agencies, all about your brother. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the children seemed to sense that something monumental was happening, something that would change how they understood their family forever. Captain Rodriguez Chen. Colonel Harrison continued with formal military precision. You have spent this afternoon publicly humiliating someone whose actual military service makes your accomplishments look like basic training exercises. You have questioned the character of someone whose clearance level is higher than mine. You have dismissed as maintenance work a cover identity that has been maintained at the highest levels of government for over 15 years. Isabella's confident posture crumbled completely. She was beginning to realize that she had made an error of catastrophic proportions, but the full scope of her mistake was still beyond her comprehension. The sacred boundary you have crossed today, Colonel Harrison said with devastating finality, is not just family loyalty or basic respect. You have attacked someone whose service to this country is so classified that I cannot discuss the details even now, in front of his own family. He looked directly at me for the first time since beginning his revelation, and I saw something in his eyes, recognition, respect, and perhaps a hint of apology for what was about to happen to my carefully maintained cover. Miguel Rodriguez, he announced to the stunned crowd, is not a municipal maintenance supervisor who used to be basic infantry. Miguel Rodriguez is a retired special operations officer whose service record is classified at levels that most military personnel will never see. The words hit Isabella like a physical blow. Her mouth opened in shock as she realized that every assumption she had made, every cruel assessment she had delivered, every dismissive comment about my character and capabilities had been based on a complete misunderstanding of who I actually was. The sacred boundary wasn't just respect for family or military service. It was the recognition that sometimes the most ordinary-looking people are hiding the most extraordinary secrets. The revelation that I was a retired special operations officer sent shockwaves through the gathered Rodriguez family, but Isabella's reaction was not what anyone expected. Instead of immediate remorse or embarrassment, her face flushed with angry disbelief. "No," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the stunned silence. "No, that's impossible. I would have known. Our family would have known. You can't just hide something like that for 15 years. Colonel Harrison raised an eyebrow at her response, clearly surprised that a commissioned officer would directly challenge information he had just received from the Department of Defense. But Isabella was too deep in denial to recognize the danger of her position. "Sir, with all due respect," she continued, her military training warring with her personal shock, "I think there's been some kind of mistake. Miguel was 11B Infantry, discharged as Staff Sergeant. I've seen his DD-21. I know his service record." The desperation in her voice was palpable, everything she had built her identity around being the family's military success story, the one who had achieved what her older brother could not, was crumbling in real time. Rather than accept the truth, she was choosing to fight it. "You've seen his cover DD-21, Colonel Harrison corrected calmly. The document that was created to protect his actual service record and maintain his operational security in civilian life. Isabella shook her head vigorously. "That doesn't make sense. Special operations doesn't work that way. There are records, documentation, evidence. You can't just pretend someone was basic infantry when they were." "When they were what, Captain?" Colonel Harrison interrupted, his tone becoming dangerously quiet. "When they were conducting classified operations that you don't have the clearance to know about, when they were serving in units whose very existence is compartmentalized information." The colonel's words carried a warning that Isabella was too distraught to heed. She was challenging information that came from the highest levels of the military hierarchy, questioning operational security procedures that were far above her clearance level. "But I'm his sister," she protested, her voice rising with frustration. "I'm a commissioned officer. I have secret clearance. If Miguel was really special operations, I would have been told. Someone would have informed me." The naivety of her statement hung in the air like an accusation. Isabella was revealing that she fundamentally misunderstood how classified operations worked, how compartmentalized information was protected, and how operational security functioned in the real world. "Captain Rodriguez Chen," Colonel Harrison said with cold precision, "your secret clearance gives you access to information relevant to your specific duties and assignment. It does not entitle you to know about classified operations conducted by other personnel." regardless of your family relationships. He paused, letting the educational moment sink in before delivering his devastating follow-up. The fact that you think it should tells me everything I need to know about your understanding of operational security and your fitness for handling classified information. Isabella's face went white as she realized she had just demonstrated serious deficiencies in her grasp of basic security protocols. But instead of backing down, she doubled down with the desperate aggression of someone whose entire worldview was collapsing. "This is ridiculous," she declared, turning to address our gathered family members. "Don't you see what's happening here? Miguel is letting this man make up stories to protect his feelings. This is all fabricated to avoid the truth about his ordinary service and dead-end job." The accusation was breathtaking in its audacity. Isabella was suggesting that a full colonel was participating in an elaborate deception to spare her brother's embarrassment at a family reunion. She was so committed to her narrative that she was willing to accuse a senior officer of misconduct rather than admit she had been wrong. "Isabella," our mother gasped, horrified by her daughter's words. But Isabella was beyond maternal correction now. She had crossed the point of no return, moving from denial into active defiance of military authority and operational security. "Think about it," she continued, gesturing wildly toward Colonel Harris. "If Miguel was really some kind of secret special operations hero, why would he be living in a rental apartment, driving an old Toyota, working maintenance for the city? Special operations officers become contractors, consultants, high-level security professionals. They don't fix air conditioning." She was using my deliberately modest lifestyle as evidence against my service record, not understanding that maintaining an unremarkable civilian profile was exactly the point of my cover identity. And why, she pressed on, would he never mention any of this to his own family? Why would he let me join the military, let me talk about my service, let me become an officer, without ever saying a word about his supposedly superior background? Isabella was revealing the depth of her ego and insecurity. In her mind, my real military service would have somehow diminished her own achievements, and she couldn't accept that I had kept quiet to protect both operational security and her sense of accomplishment. Colonel Harrison watched this meltdown with the clinical attention of someone documenting evidence for what would clearly be a career-ending report. Every word Isabella spoke was digging her professional grave deeper. "Captain," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of official displeasure, "you are now questioning the veracity of classified information provided by the Department of Defense, suggesting that a senior officer is participating in deception and demonstrating a fundamental misunderstanding of operational security protocols." The formality of his language made it clear that this was no longer a family dispute. This had become an official military matter with serious professional consequences. "Sir, Isabella began, finally beginning to realize the magnitude of her error. "You have accused your brother of living a lie," Colonel Harrison continued relentlessly. "You have suggested that his service record is fabricated. You have implied that his current job is evidence of personal failure rather than ongoing operational necessity." He closed his notebook with finality. "Captain Rodriguez Chen, you have just committed yourself to a position that questions the integrity of classified military operations. That is not a mistake you can take back." Isabella stood frozen, finally understanding that she had crossed a line from which there was no return. Her desperate need to maintain her superiority had led her to challenge the very foundations of military operational security. The point of no return wasn't just about family dynamics anymore. It was about her military career, her security clearance, and her future in the service she had claimed to represent with such distinction. The desert evening air seemed to crystallize around our family gathering as the weight of Isabella's accusations settled over the crowd. For 15 years I had maintained my cover identity with meticulous care, living the quiet life of a municipal maintenance supervisor while carrying out responsibilities that most people would never imagine. But my sister's desperate denial had pushed this situation beyond the boundaries of family conflict into something that threatened operational security itself. I had remained silent throughout Isabella's systematic destruction of my reputation, allowing her to paint me as a failure and a disappointment while my family watched in growing horror. That silence had been strategic, both to protect my cover and to allow Isabella enough rope to hang herself professionally. But her direct challenge to classified military operations, had crossed a line that I could not allow to stand uncorrected. For the first time since this confrontation began, I slowly rose from my seat at the picnic table. The movement was subtle, but everyone present felt the shift in energy. It wasn't the casual adjustment of someone getting comfortable. It was the deliberate positioning of someone preparing to take control of a situation. My posture straightened with unconscious military bearing, my shoulders squared, and my eyes took on the focused attention of someone who had commanded respect in life-or-death situations. Colonel Harrison noticed immediately. His expression shifted from professional displeasure to something approaching recognition and anticipation. He had suspected there was more to me than met the eye, but now he was seeing the first glimpse of the officer I had once been. "Isabella," I said quietly, my voice carrying a tone that none of my family had ever heard before. It wasn't the gentle voice of their maintenance worker relative. It was the controlled authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. My sister turned toward me, her face flushed with the desperate defiance of someone who knew she was losing but couldn't admit defeat. "Miguel, tell them this is all nonsense. Tell them you're not pretending to be something you're." I looked at her for a long moment, studying the face of the little sister who had once looked up to me with such admiration. The transformation from that loving child to this bitter, insecure officer was heartbreaking. But her attack on operational security had made personal considerations irrelevant. "Captain Rodriguez Chen," I said, using her military rank with the precise formality of someone who understood military protocol far better than she had realized. "You are correct that I have been living under a carefully maintained cover identity for the past 15 years. The admission sent a ripple of shock through our gathered family members. Isabella's eyes widened with what she thought was vindication, but I wasn't finished. However, I continued, my voice taking on the edge of authority that came from years of briefing senior officials and commanding elite units. "Your assumption that this cover identity represents deception rather than operational necessity demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of how classified operations function in the real world." I took a step forward, and something in my movement made Isabella instinctively step back. The family dynamic had shifted completely. The quiet older brother was gone, replaced by someone whose presence commanded immediate attention. "You've spent the afternoon attacking my character, my service record, and my life choices based on incomplete information and false assumptions," I said, my words carrying the precision of someone delivering a briefing to hostile intelligence operative. "More importantly, you've challenged the operational security protocols that protect not just me, but the ongoing missions and personnel that my cover identity was designed to shield." Colonel Harrison was watching this transformation with fascination. He was seeing a carefully maintained civilian persona fall away to reveal the professional military officer beneath. Every word, every gesture, every subtle shift in my bearing confirmed what his phone calls had told him about my actual background. "Miguel," our mother whispered, confusion and concern evident in her voice. She had never seen this version of her son, had never heard him speak with such authority or carry himself with such commanding presence. I turned to address her with gentleness but without losing the underlying steel in my voice. "Mama, I'm sorry you had to learn about this in such circumstances. My work has required maintaining certain discretions about my background and current responsibilities." Isabella, however, was still fighting against the reality that was emerging. "You're just trying to save face," she declared, but her voice lacked its earlier confidence. "This is all an act to avoid admitting that you've wasted your life." The accusation hung in the air like a final challenge. I looked at my sister with something approaching pity, recognizing that her desperate need to maintain her superiority was driving her to attack even when defeat was inevitable. "Captain," I said with the quiet authority of someone who had once held command responsibility she couldn't imagine, "your assessment of my life and career is based on a cover story that was specifically designed to appear ordinary and unremarkable. The fact that you believed it so completely is evidence that it accomplished its intended purpose." I paused, letting that information settle before continuing. "What you don't understand is that some of us serve our country in ways that require us to appear unsuccessful, unremarkable, and forgettable. Some of us sacrifice recognition, advancement, and personal glory to maintain the security of operations that protect American lives. The words hit Isabella like physical blows. She was beginning to realize that everything she had used to measure her superiority over me, my modest lifestyle, my quiet demeanor, my unremarkable job, had been carefully constructed elements of a mission that was far more important than her logistics, coordination, and training exercise. The maintenance work you've mocked so cruelly, I continued relentlessly, provides cover for responsibilities that include coordinating with federal agencies on matters of national security. The dead-end job you've ridiculed gives me access to critical infrastructure systems that are essential to homeland defense. The ordinary life you've dismissed as failure is actually one of the most sophisticated cover operations the government has ever maintained. Colonel Harrison stepped forward, recognizing that this was the moment for official confirmation. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced to the gathered family, "you are looking at retired Brigadier General Miguel Rodriguez, formerly of the Army's Special Operations Command, whose classified service record includes some of the most sensitive missions conducted in the past 2 decades." The silence that followed was absolute. Isabella's face went through a range of emotions: shock, disbelief, horror, and finally, the devastating realization that she had spent the afternoon systematically destroying someone whose actual achievements made her own career look like basic training. The transformation was complete. The quiet maintenance worker had revealed himself to be one of the most distinguished soldiers any of them had ever met, and Isabella's military career was about to end in disgrace. The revelation of my true rank and background had left the entire Rodriguez family in stunned silence. My relatives stood frozen in the desert evening air, trying to process the fact that the quiet maintenance worker they thought they knew was actually a retired brigadier general whose service record was classified at the highest levels of government. Isabella stood at the center of this revelation like someone who had just watched their entire world collapse. Her face cycled through expressions of disbelief, horror, and desperate calculation as she tried to find some way to salvage the situation. But the damage was done, and everyone present knew it. Colonel Harrison maintained his position near our table, his notebook still open, clearly documenting everything for what would undoubtedly become an official report. Lieutenant Chen and Lieutenant Webb looked like they wanted to disappear entirely, recognizing that they had just witnessed their captain commit career suicide in the most spectacular way possible. Despite the magnitude of Isabella's error, despite the cruelty of her attacks, and despite the professional consequences she now faced, I found myself looking at my younger sister with something approaching compassion. She was trapped in a situation entirely of her own making, but she was still family. "Isabella," I said quietly, my voice carrying the authority of my actual rank, but tempered with the concern of an older brother, "you have one opportunity to salvage something from this situation." She looked up at me with desperate hope, grasping for any lifeline that might save her from the professional destruction she could see approaching. "Sir?" she whispered, unconsciously using the respectful address that my revealed rank demanded. I took a measured step closer, close enough that our conversation could be private while still being overheard by Colonel Harrison and our family members. When I spoke, my voice carried the tone of someone offering counsel that should be accepted without question. "You can acknowledge your error, apologize for your misconduct, and request permission to withdraw your statements attacking classified operations and questioning operational security protocols," I said with careful precision. "You can admit that your assessment was based on incomplete information and express regret for overstepping your authority and clearance level." The offer hung in the desert air like a lifeline thrown to someone drowning in their own mistake. She was more mercy than Isabella deserved, given the systematic cruelty of her attack, but it was the last chance she would receive to demonstrate any capacity for military judgment and personal growth. "If you do this now," I continued, immediately and without further justification or explanation, Colonel Harrison might be willing to treat this as a severe lapse in judgment, rather than evidence of fundamental unfitness for military service. Isabella's eyes darted between my face and Colonel Harrison's, clearly calculating her option. The smart choice was obvious to everyone present: accept responsibility, apologize sincerely, and hoped that her commanding officer would show mercy for what could charitably be described as a family dispute that had gotten out of hand. But Isabella had spent the entire afternoon building her identity around being superior to her maintenance worker brother. Accepting my offer would mean admitting that everything she had said was not just wrong but devastatingly, humiliatingly wrong. It would mean acknowledging that the brother she had mocked as a failure was actually one of the most distinguished soldiers she would ever meet. Miguel, sir, she began hesitantly. I'm trying to understand how this is possible. How could you have been a general and never told your own family? How could you let me join the military, become an officer without ever mentioning that you outranked everyone I've ever served under? The questions revealed that Isabella still didn't grasp the fundamental concept of operational security. Even now, faced with the destruction of her career, she was focused on her own feelings rather than the larger principles she had violated. Captain, I replied with the patience of someone who had spent years teaching junior officers about classified operations. My cover identity was maintained to protect ongoing missions and personal considerations, including family relationships, are irrelevant when operational security is at stake. I paused, giving her time to absorb the lesson before continuing. The fact that you're asking these questions demonstrates that you still don't understand the nature of the classified work that some military personnel are called to perform. Colonel Harrison stepped forward slightly, making it clear that he was observing this exchange as an official evaluation of Isabella's judgment and character. His expression suggested that her next words would determine whether she had any future in military service. Captain Rodriguez Chen, he said formally, General Rodriguez has offered you an opportunity to demonstrate military bearing and professional judgment. I suggest you consider your response very carefully. The weight of official displeasure in his voice made it clear that this was her final chance. Isabella could either accept responsibility for her misconduct and hope for mercy, or she could continue down the path of denial and face the full consequences of challenging classified military operations. The choice was stark and the deadline was immediate. Everyone present understood that Isabella's next words would determine not just her military career, but her standing with her family and her own sense of self-worth. I watched my sister struggle with the decision, seeing the war between her ego and her survival instincts playing out across her face. The smart choice was obvious, but it required her to admit that everything she had built her identity around was based on false assumptions and cruel misjudgment. Isabella, I said gently, using her name rather than her rank, this is your last chance to do the right thing, not for your career, not for Colonel Harrison, but for yourself and for our family. The offer carried the weight of brotherly love despite everything she had said about me. I was giving her one final opportunity to demonstrate that the little sister who had once looked up to me with admiration was still somewhere inside the bitter officer who had tried to destroy my reputation. You can end this now, I continued quietly, with dignity and honor, or you can continue down a path that will destroy everything you've worked for and leave you with nothing but regret. The silence stretched across the desert evening as Isabella stood at the crossroads of her life, faced with a choice that would define not just her career, but her character. The final warning had been given. Now we would see if she was wise enough to heed it.
The silence stretched across the community center pavilion. Isabella stood at the crossroads of her military career. Every person present, family members, young lieutenants and Colonel Harrison, waited to see if she would accept the lifeline I had offered or continue down the path of professional destruction. Isabella's face underwent a series of emotional transitions as she weighed her options. For a moment, I saw a flicker of the wise choice, the recognition that she should accept responsibility and try to salvage what remained of her career. But then her pride reasserted itself, and I watched as she made the decision that would seal her fate. "No," she said finally, her voice carrying the stubborn defiance of someone who would rather be right than survive. "I don't accept this. I've spent 6 years building my military career, based on merit and achievement. I'm not going to let some elaborate story undermine everything I've worked for." She turned to address Colonel Harrison directly, her posture rigid with desperate authority. "Sir, I demand to see official documentation of these alleged achievements. I want to see service records, promotion orders, unit assignments. You can't just claim someone was a general without proof. The audacity of her demand sent a visible shock through the crowd. Isabella was not just refusing the mercy I had offered, she was escalating her challenge to military authority and operational security protocols. Colonel Harrison's expression shifted from disappointed to coldly professional. Captain Rodriguez Chen, you are demanding access to classified information that is far above your clearance level. Are you certain you want to continue down this path? Yes, sir, Isabella replied with fatal confidence. I am a commissioned officer with secret clearance. If my brother was really a general, I have the right to know about it. The fundamental mental understanding of how classified operations worked was staggering. Isabella was doubling down on her misconceptions, using her limited security clearance as justification for access to information that was compartmentalized at levels she couldn't comprehend. I looked at Colonel Harrison and gave him a slight nod. Isabella had refused my final warning and chosen to escalate the situation. It was time to demonstrate exactly how outclassed she was in every measure she had used to attack me. Captain, I said, my voice taking on the crisp authority of someone briefing senior government officials, since you've demanded documentation, let me share some details that are within the bounds of what can be discussed at your clearance level. I reached into my wallet and withdrew a card that I had carried for 15 years, but never shown to anyone in my family. It was an emergency contact card, seemingly innocuous, but encoded with information that would be immediately recognizable to anyone with appropriate clearance. Colonel Harrison, I said formally, would you mind verifying the authentication codes on this card? The colonel took the card and examined it carefully, his eyebrows rising as he processed the information. These are valid emergency contact protocols for Special Activities Division, he confirmed. Current as of this month. Isabella's face went pale. Special Activities Division was not something that appeared on the service records of basic infantry soldiers or municipal maintenance workers. My current responsibilities, I continued with the measured tone of someone delivering a classified briefing, include consulting on critical infrastructure vulnerabilities for the Department of Homeland Security. The maintenance work that Captain Rodriguez Chen has mocked so thoroughly provides cover for regular security assessments of government facilities across 3 southwestern states. I paused, letting that information settle before continuing. The dead-end job she's ridiculed grants me access to building systems, security protocols and emergency procedures for facilities that are designated as essential to national security operations. Colonel Harrison was taking notes again, documenting this revelation with the attention of someone who now understood the scope of what he was witnessing. The federal agency coordination that confused Captain Rodriguez Chen earlier includes regular briefings with officials from the Department of Defense, the CIA, and the National Security Agency. I continued relentlessly. The emergency response protocols she dismissed as calling the fire department actually involve coordinating with federal rapid response teams during potential terrorist threats. Each revelation was a hammer blow to Isabella's worldview. Everything she had used to measure her superiority over me was being revealed as evidence of sophisticated ongoing operations that dwarfed her logistic coordination responsibility. My DD-214 shows discharge as a staff sergeant, I said, addressing her earlier challenge directly, because my promotion to general rank occurred within classified units, whose personnel records are maintained separately from conventional military databases. The service record you think you know represents approximately 8% of my actual military career. Isabella was swaying slightly, overwhelmed by the magnitude of her miscalculation. But I wasn't finished. The rental apartment and old Toyota that you cited as evidence of failure, I continued with relentless precision. They're part of a lifestyle maintenance protocol designed to ensure that my cover identity remains credible and unremarkable. The government actually pays me a substantial consulting fee specifically to maintain the appearance of ordinary civilian employment. I turned to address Colonel Harrison directly. Colonel, would you be willing to confirm my current security clearance level for Captain Rodriguez Chen? Colonel Harrison consulted his notebook, then looked at Isabella with something approaching pity. "Captain, General Rodriguez maintains clearances at levels that I cannot discuss in this setting. What I can tell you is that his access to classified information exceeds that of most active duty generals." The final blow was delivered with quiet precision. Isabella had spent the afternoon attacking someone whose actual clearance level and operational responsibilities were so far above her own that she couldn't even comprehend the comparison. "Captain Rodriguez Chen," I said with the finality of someone delivering a verdict, "you have spent this afternoon systematically attacking the character and achievements of someone whose actual service record makes your entire military career look like a training exercise. You have questioned operational security procedures that protect ongoing missions involving national security. You have demonstrated fundamental mental understandings about how classified operations function." I paused, making eye contact with each of my family members before returning my attention to Isabella. "Most importantly, you have revealed character deficiencies that make you fundamentally unsuitable for positions of trust and responsibility in military service." The devastating assessment hung in the desert air like a final judgment. Isabella stood completely defeated, her arguments destroyed, her misconceptions exposed, and her career effectively ended by her own choices. Colonel Harrison closed his notebook with finality. "Captain Rodriguez Chen, report to my office at 0800 Monday morning. We have a great deal to discuss about your future in military service." The overwhelming display of competence was complete. Isabella had demanded proof, and she had received a demonstration that revealed the staggering gap between her assumptions and reality. The aftermath of my revelation settled over the family reunion like a desert storm passing through, leaving everything changed in its way. Isabella stood frozen in the center of our gathered relatives, her face a mask of shock and dawning horror as the full implications of her actions began to sink in. Colonel Harrison stepped forward with the measured precision of a senior officer who had just witnessed a catastrophic breach of military protocol and professional judgment. His expression was no longer that of a family gathering attendee. It was the cold assessment of a commanding officer evaluating a subordinate who had demonstrated fundamental unfitness for service. "Captain Rodriguez Chen," he said formally, his voice carrying across the pavilion with unmistakable authority, "you are hereby relieved of your duties, pending a full investigation into your conduct and fitness for continued military service." The words hit Isabella like physical blows. Being relieved of duty was the first step in a process that would likely end with her separation from the military, the loss of her security clearance, and the destruction of the career she had spent 6 years building. "Sir, please," she whispered, the defiance finally cracking to reveal the terrified young officer underneath. "I didn't know. I thought—" "You thought what, Captain?" Colonel Harrison interrupted, his tone sharp with official displeasure. "You thought you could challenge classified military operations based on your assumptions. You thought your family relationship entitled you to access information above your clearance level. You thought you could publicly attack a senior officer's character and service record without consequence." Each question was a formal accusation that would undoubtedly appear in the investigation report. Isabella's desperate attempts to justify her actions were only making her situation worse. Lieutenant Chen and Lieutenant Webb sat in stunned silence, recognizing that they had just witnessed their captain commit career suicide in the most spectacular way possible. Their association with Isabella's misconduct would follow them throughout their own military careers, a cautionary tale about the importance of character and judgment in military leadership. Furthermore, Colonel Harrison continued relentlessly, "Your conduct today has demonstrated serious deficiencies in your understanding of operational security, your respect for military hierarchy, and your fitness to handle classified information. I will be recommending immediate suspension of your security clearance pending investigation." The loss of her security clearance would end Isabella's military career instantly. Without clearance, she couldn't perform her current duties, couldn't advance in rank, and couldn't transfer to any meaningful position within the intelligence community. Our mother was crying openly now, finally understanding the magnitude of what had transpired. Her daughter's military career, the source of so much family pride, was ending in disgrace, destroyed by her own cruel arrogance and professional incompetence. "Sir," Isabella tried one more desperate plea, "surely this can be handled as a family matter, a misunderstanding that got out of hand." I was emotional, I said things I didn't mean. "Captain," I interrupted quietly, my voice carrying the weight of my actual rank and experience, "this stopped being a family matter the moment you challenged classified operations and questioned military authority. Your emotional state doesn't excuse your fundamental violations of military protocol and professional judgment." I looked at her with something between pity and disappointment. "You had multiple opportunities to de-escalate this situation. You were offered mercy and chose defiance. You were given chances to demonstrate military bearing and chose personal attack. Every choice you made today revealed character deficiencies that make you unsuitable for military service." Colonel Harrison pulled out his phone and began making calls. Within minutes, he had contacted the base security office, the personnel division, and his own chain of command. The wheels of military justice were already turning, and Isabella's fate was being sealed by officers who had never met her but would judge her solely on her demonstrated conduct. Base security is en route to collect Captain Rodriguez Chan's credentials and escort her from the premises, Colonel Harrison announced to the gathered family. Her computer access has been suspended, her office sealed, and her current cases transferred to other personnel. The efficiency was breathtaking. Within an hour of Isabella's first attack on my character, her military career was effectively over. The system she had claimed to represent with such distinction had judged her unworthy and acted with swift finality. Lieutenant Chen finally found her voice. "Sir, what about our unit assignments? Our current projects?" "Lieutenant Chen, Lieutenant Webb," Colonel Harrison replied with professional courtesy, "you will report to Captain Martinez Monday morning. She will be assuming command of your unit, pending permanent assignment of a new commanding officer." The young officers nodded glumly, understanding that their careers would be marked by their association with Isabella's spectacular failure. They would spend years proving that they didn't share their former captain's character deficiencies and professional incompetence. Isabella sat down heavily at the picnic table, her military posture finally collapsing as the reality of her situation became undeniable. She was 35 years old, about to lose the only career she had ever known, facing the destruction of her professional reputation and family standing. "Miguel," she whispered, using my name rather than my rank for the first time since the revelation, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I never meant for this to happen." I looked at my sister with genuine sadness. "Isabella, you spent 6 years in military service without learning the most basic lessons about humility, respect, and operational security. You used your rank to justify cruelty and your authority to attack family. This didn't happen to you. You chose this outcome with every word you spoke today." The sound of approaching vehicles announced the arrival of base security personnel. 2 military police officers and a security specialist would escort Isabella from the reunion, collect her credentials, and begin the formal process that would end her military career. Our family watched in stunned silence as the consequences of Isabella's choices played out with swift military efficiency. The sister they had admired for her achievements was being led away in disgrace, her career destroyed by her own arrogance and professional incompetence. "General Rodriguez," Colonel Harrison said formally, extending his hand, "it has been an honor to meet you, sir. I apologize for the circumstances and for Captain Rodriguez Chen's conduct toward you and your family." I shook his hand with professional courtesy. "Thank you, Colonel." Sometimes these situations reveal important truths about character and judgment that needed to be exposed. As the military vehicles departed with Isabella and her former colleagues, our family reunion settled into shocked silence. The truth about my background had been revealed. My sister's military career had ended in disgrace, and the Rodriguez family would never be the same. The immediate consequences were complete, swift, and irreversible. The dust from the departing military vehicles settled over our family reunion as the desert evening painted the Arizona sky in shades of gold and crimson. What had begun as a simple gathering to celebrate family bonds had become a profound lesson about character, humility, and the dangers of judging others by appearances. Our relatives stood in stunned silence around the picnic tables, processing the magnitude of what they had witnessed. The quiet maintenance worker they thought they knew had been revealed as one of the most distinguished soldiers any of them would ever meet. The accomplished military officer they had admired had been exposed as someone whose cruelty and arrogance made her unfit for service. My mother was the first to break the silence. She approached me with tears streaming down her face, but they were no longer tears of sadness. They were tears of pride, understanding, and profound regret for what her daughter had become. "Misho," she whispered, reaching up to touch my face with trembling hands. "All these years, you let us think. You let Isabella believe." She couldn't finish the sentence, overwhelmed by the realization of the sacrifice I had made to protect both my mission and my sister's sense of accomplishment. "Mama," I replied gently, taking her hands in mine. "My job was to serve my country, not to receive recognition for it. Some of us are called to remain in the shadows so others can stand in the light." My father stepped forward, his weathered face reflecting a mixture of awe and shame. "Miguel, forgive me. We all thought you had settled for less. We never understood that you were serving something greater than all of us." Uncle Roberto, the family patriarch who had always valued hard work and honest achievement, shook his head in wonder. "All this time you were protecting us, not just our family, but our entire community, our country, and we never knew." My teenage nephew Carlos approached with wide eyes full of newfound respect. "Uncle Miguel, does this mean all those times Isabella said you weren't successful, you were actually—" "I was doing exactly what my country needed me to do," I replied, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Success isn't measured by recognition or rank or money, Carlos. True success is measured by how well you serve something bigger than yourself, even when no one knows you're doing." As word of what had transpired spread through the extended family, relatives who had been scattered across the pavilion gathered around our table. Each person who approached brought their own perspective on what they had witnessed, but all shared a common theme: profound respect for sacrifice they had never understood, and deep shame for assumptions they had never questioned. My cousin Maria wiped tears from her eyes as she spoke. "Miguel, I'm so sorry. All those family gatherings where Isabella talked about her military achievements while you stayed quiet, you were letting her shine while you'd accomplished so much more." "Isabella needed to find her own path," I replied, diplomatically, though the irony was not lost on anyone present. Her accomplishments were real, even if her character wasn't what we hoped it would be. As the evening progressed, a remarkable transformation took place among my family members. The revelation of my background had done more than expose Isabella's cruelty. It had forced everyone to examine their own assumptions about success, service, and the value of different types of work. My cousin David, a successful Phoenix businessman, sat down across from me with humbled expression. "You know what bothers me most about today? It's not just what Isabella said to you, it's that we all believed it. At least a little. We all thought she was the family's success story while you were just getting by." He paused, struggling with the implications of what he was admitting. "How many other people do we dismiss because they don't fit our idea of achievement? How many quiet heroes are we overlooking because they don't advertise their worth?" The question resonated through the gathered family, sparking conversations about neighbors, co-workers, and acquaintances who might be far more than they appear. The lesson was expanding beyond our family drama to touch on fundamental questions about how we value people and judge their contributions to society. My great-aunt Esperanza, at 89, the oldest member of our family, spoke with the wisdom of someone who had seen decades of human folly. "This is what happens when we mistake noise for substance, when we confuse attention for achievement." Isabella made herself loud and obvious, while Miguel made himself useful and invisible. One serves the ego, the other serves the mission. As the sun set completely over the desert, casting our gathering in the warm glow of string lights, I found myself reflecting on the deeper meaning of what had transpired. Isabella's downfall wasn't just the result of her personal cruelty, it was the inevitable consequence of fundamental misunderstandings about leadership, service, and what makes a life meaningful. "I want to share something with all of you," I said, standing to address my assembled family. What happened today wasn't really about military rank or classified operations, or even family dynamics. It was about something much more fundamental. I looked around at the faces of my relatives, seeing genuine attention and respect for perhaps the first time in my adult life. Isabella made the mistake of believing that recognition equals worth, that visibility equals value, that rank equals respect. She thought that because her achievements were public and mine were hidden, hers were more important than mine. I paused, choosing my words carefully for the lesson I wanted to leave with them. But the truth is that the most important work in this world is often done by people you'll never hear about. The security guards who protect our buildings, the teachers who shape our children, the mechanics who keep our vehicles running, the janitors who maintain our hospitals, all of them are serving something bigger than themselves, even if they never receive recognition for it. My nephew Carlos raised his hand tentatively. Uncle Miguel, how do we know who the real heroes are if they're supposed to stay hidden? The question brought a smile to my face. You don't look for heroes, Micho. You become one. You find your own way to serve something bigger than yourself, whether anyone notices or not. You treat every person with respect, because you never know what they've sacrificed or achieved in service to others. As our family reunion finally began to wind down, relatives approached me one by one to express their newfound understanding and respect. But more importantly, they shared how the evening's events had changed their perspective on their own lives, and the lives of those around. The custodian at Maria's hospital, the maintenance staff at David's office building, the quiet veterans at Roberto's American Legion post, all of them would be seen differently now, treated with greater respect, and recognized as potential heroes whose stories remained untold. As I prepared to leave, my mother took my arm one final time. Miguel, what Isabella did tonight, will she be able to recover from this? I considered the question carefully before answering. Mama, Isabella has a choice to make. She can learn from this experience, accept responsibility for her actions, and find a new path that serves others instead of her own ego. Or she can continue to blame others for consequences she brought on herself. I looked toward the darkness where the military vehicles had disappeared hours earlier. Some people use failure as a foundation for growth, others use it as an excuse for bitterness. Only Isabella can decide which person she'll choose to become. The final cars began pulling out of the community center parking lot, carrying family members who had arrived expecting a routine reunion, and were leaving with a completely transformed understanding of success, service, and the hidden heroes who walk among us every day. As I drove home through the desert night, I reflected on the price of truth and the value of humility. My cover identity had been blown, my quiet life forever changed, but perhaps something more important had been accomplished. A family had learned to look beyond appearances, to question their assumptions, and to recognize that the most meaningful achievements are often the ones that remain invisible. In a world obsessed with recognition and status, the quiet heroes continue their work in the shadows, serving something greater than themselves, expecting nothing in return except the knowledge that their sacrifice mattered. That is the ultimate lesson of true service, not the glory we receive, but the legacy we leave in the lives we touch, and the missions we complete, whether anyone ever knows our names or not. Some stories end with victory parades and public recognition. This one ended with something far more valuable, a family's awakened understanding that the greatest heroes are often the ones standing right beside us, wearing ordinary clothes and carrying extraordinary secrets in service to us all.
You've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.